thank you all for coming and welcome you all. This is our first presentation for the Bailey's Harbour Historical Society, and we were lucky enough to get our hometown boy, Bill Tischler, here to do the presentation on the Frogtown Art Colony today. So before we begin, there's just a few little housekeeping things I want to take care of. For all of you, or any of you who do not have coffee or brownies, there's coffee and brownies in the back. If you want to go get a cup of coffee and a brownie, please help yourself. There's also tea. We'd also like for you to sign this attendance sheet with your name and your address and your phone number, and that will enable you to get some mailings from us from time to time. So I'm just going to start this at this table over here. I also want to say that it is so gratifying to see so many Bailey's Harborites here today. It's just people who have a passion for the history of this town and who want to keep those memories alive. I'm just going to start out by giving you a little bit of the history of the Bailey's Harbour Historical Society. It all began a year ago in June, so we're relatively new, and it began when the town board asked for a committee to study the acquisition of the McArdle house. At that time, the committee decided it wasn't the right time to purchase any dwelling at that time, but it really pointed out the need to preserve the history of Bailey's Harbour. So that's when the Historical Society got started. We were lucky enough to have a person by the name of Dorothy Cole, who has had experience working with the Wisconsin Historical Society, to head us up and get us started in the right direction, get us started in getting to be a nonprofit, and we worked on that this year. And we had a gentleman from the Wisconsin Historical Society, Rick Bernstein, who came and told us about the Wisconsin Historical Society and what we needed to do and how you go about doing it. So that's kind of our beginnings. I also want to recognize today the people who are on the committee. And we have Leanne Espodes over here. We have Carol Schmidt in the background. Roseanne, raise your hand. Roseanne Gertman is on the board. Roy Cole is our president. Christine Pyle, right over here. And who else am I forgetting? Susie Ball. We can't forget Susie. She forgot. She made the brownies today. She's very important. And Steve Cage, who joins us. So we are very happy for these people who have consented to be on the beginning committee board. We also are looking for other people who are interested in being a part of this board. We are also looking, as you can see by the information we handed out, if you have any special skills, computer skills, archival skills, if you like doing assessments of items, there's a whole range where people can decide to help us out. So if you have a special skill that you would be willing to share, computer skills, videographer skills, any of those things are much needed because, like I said, we're in the infancy stages right now. So now is a real time, good time to get aboard. So those are the things I just wanted to kind of begin this session with, so you know what the Historical Society is about and what some of the things are that we're going to be doing in the future. And if you read your material, you can see some of the programming that we're going to be having available. Today was also a day when we were going to honor Mary Ann Johnson, and many of you know Mary Ann. She has done a lot already to preserve the history of this town, and we can't thank her enough, but she had a previous engagement. So our July 14th meeting will feature honoring Mary Ann Johnson, and I hope that many of you will come. We're going to present her with a plaque and pictures and some of the things that she has done, all on her own time. So I'm sorry she couldn't be here today. But without further ado, I wanted to say something about our presenter today. As I said, Bill Tischler is one of our local boys. And I got a big kick out of this because one of our committee members, she said, he was a godlike icon for me when I was young. He flew his model plane in the field behind her house. And nobody had one of these remote-controlled planes at the time. And she said, I just thought he was just the coolest guy. So, Bill, you were destined for big things. Even back then, you made an impression with that model plane. So, anyway, he is a professor emeritus from the University of Wisconsin. He is a landscape architect of great renown. Bill has written books. My favorite, of course, as I was telling you today, is the one about Peninsula Park, the Emerald Island, or the Emerald Treasure. If you want to get a definitive history of Peninsula Park, I invite you to read that book. It is excellent. So many things that I did not know about Peninsula Park. So he's quite a historian. So when we asked him to talk about the Frogtown Art Colony, we were so pleased when he said, well, of course I'll come. And so I hope this turns into a book also, because we're fans of yours, Bill. So welcome. Thank you for coming, Bill, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Lynn. Can everyone hear me in the back of the room? Just before we started, I leaped up on the stage to pull the screen down so we'd get a better image, and I kind of remembered back, I think the last time I was up there, I sang in a barbershop quartet with Joe Parent, Orville Langer, and Dale Orsted. Some of you may remember those names. I was also a little worried that I'd get here on time because my wife and I, when we're out driving, we like to go down some of the back roads and, look at barns and interesting communities and so on. And we are up in Kewaunee County going down a back road past a little town called Frog Station. Have you ever heard of Frog Station? Yeah. Well, it's in Kewaunee County on the Kewaunee-Ozaukee County line, I think it was. Anyway, I thought she'd filled the car up with gas, and she thought I filled up with gas. And we're going down this back road, and all at once, put, 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 the car stopped, and oh gosh.
Could you use the microphone? I have a couple people back.
Yes, sure. Okay.
Right over there.
Oh, this one. All righty. Now I can move around with this one, right? Okay. Anyway, there we were, out of gas. And I thought, oh God, we don't even have a gas can, and there's no filling station in sight. Anyway, a car came along and stopped, and there were two really nice nuns in it. And they asked, sir, can we be of any help? And I said, well, sister, we're out of gas, and we don't have a gas can. And they said, well, we don't either. Then the other one that was driving spoke up and said, well, wait a minute, we've got a bedpan. They just been to a retirement home in the area. We'll go down and get some gas in that. That'll hold at least enough to get you started. So they jumped back in their car and went down and came back in about 5 minutes. And one of the nuns got out, and she insisted on pouring the gas in the gas tank. I said, sister, you don't have to do that. I can take care of it. And no, I'll do it. So there she was pouring gas into the tank, and another car came by, and it passed us a little ways, and the guy who was driving slammed on the brakes. And he backed up and he said, sister, if you can make that car run on that stuff, I'm turning Catholic. I hope I'm not offending any Catholics. Anyway, I hope I'm not offending any Catholics. I have a lot of good friends that are Catholics. Okay, next slide, Leanne.
Oh, can you get the lights up?
Well, the story of the Frogtown Art Colony really begins, of course, with the Chicago Art Institute. It's world-renowned, and since its beginnings, it sponsored educational programs. It had some summer schools shortly after the turn of the century, maybe a little before. One of them was at Saugatuck, Michigan, the Saugatuck Art School. Anyway, next slide. This is an early shot that I got from a friend of my aunt's, Hannah Pruder, who lived in Bailey's Harbor. Her name was Gladys Anderson, and her maiden name was, her grandfather's name, I know, was an Apple. That's an old Door County family name. But she had this shot of the Art Institute and the artists, the budding artists at work, doing some what looks like pretty nice portraits and other landscape scenes. Next slide. Well, several decades after the art school began, World War I broke out. And America, of course, joined the Allies in 1917, just a little over a year before it ended. Finally, it did end. Next slide. And like today, there were a lot of people that were hurt, wounded. They were gassed. My father was in World War I in France, and my older brothers and sisters tell me that he had some experience with gas. And like today, they, I imagine, had post-traumatic stress syndrome, I think is the right term for it, and lost limbs and so on. Anyway, these people came back to civilian life, and some of them enrolled, next slide, at the Art Institute. Now, the Art Institute, actually they enrolled under a type of, it was like a GI Bill, but it was called the Soldiers Rehabilitation Act of 1918. That gave them a little bit of a pension, and to the wounded people from veterans from World War I. Some of those people enrolled at the art school, and while they were there, some of them had F. DeForest Shook, or Fred Shook was his nickname, as an instructor, along with Frederick Victor Poole. Well, when Shook was at the art school, he happened to run into two young ladies who had spent a lot of time in Door County. One of them was Alice Apfelbach. That's an old Fish Creek name. Her married name is Alice Myers. Another one was a friend of Alice's by the name of Holtz. She was probably related to Ferdy Holtz, who at one time was called the largest landowner in Door County. Anyway, they had their work critiqued by Mr. Shook, and sometimes these two gals would talk about Door County. What a beautiful place it was. And Mr. Shook, you should really go up there. Now, I don't know which of these people, the man on the right or the man on the left, is Mr. Shook. If any of you know, I'd be very interested in finding out. I think probably the fellow on the left. He looks kind of dapper, and although maybe that was Mr. Poole as well. So anyway, shortly later, in 1921, Shook took his family up to visit Door County. And they were literally overwhelmed by the scenery here and the cool climate. It was nice to get out of Chicago when it was hot there during the summer. And he decided to buy some property just south of Bailey's Harbor. And he drew up plans for a summer retreat. Next slide. This is a person who is Mr. Shook's daughter, Alice Cole. She's a person who gave me a lot of information about what I have to talk about. I interviewed her back in, I think it was 1986. She had a lot of good memories. I don't think she's living any longer. I haven't seen her lately, at least. Perhaps some of you may know. At any rate, her father came up to Door County and selected a tract of land along Lake Michigan. Next slide. And you go to the next slide after that, too. I'm getting ahead of myself. This is what Bailey's Harbor probably looked like back about then. Notice the old limestone quarry up on the bluff behind our grade school. There were still remnants of it when I went to grade school there. You can see the Pruder Mill with a tower jutting up just ahead of the point across the bay. You can see the old Bailey's Harbor Town Hall, the big white building on the right, and some other buildings that are Betcher's House, Schramm's House, Schramm's Hall, some other recognizable buildings. Anyway, this is a nice old postcard of Bailey's Harbor. It probably looks something like this, so this postcard may have been a little earlier time-wise, maybe a little before the 1920s. Now, the area that Shook bought had been completely cut over at one time. There still even were some big old stumps that remained. Next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. This is the Boynton Bjorklanden property shoreline. So this is probably a good bit what the tract of land looked like that he bought. Next slide. Now, Shook was an interesting guy. He was an artist. He was also interested a bit in architecture, and he was very interested in some of the log buildings in the area. So when he got around to building, the building he drew up, at least the first part of it from his plans, he bought an old log barn from the Charles Hunold farm, which was located just to the south of Peninsula Center. Some of the local farmers took it apart log by log and moved it to his property and put it back together. They just stacked up the logs, though, in Lincoln log-like fashion. Later, Mr. Shook hired two local carpenters, Frank Oldenburg and my father, Bill Tischler, who worked with Mr. Oldenburg. And they came and cut openings in the logs for the doors and windows. They put in a floor, and they put in a roof, of course. They built a hole in the floor so that the second floor could be accessible with a ladder. Later, the carpenters built two adjoining stairways. One was built by Mr. Oldenburg, and one was built by my father. I have to brag a little here because Mrs. Cole mentioned to me that her father would say, and I quote, "That Bill Tischler, he knows what he's doing." And that her father admired his work because Dad, quote, "was so particular," end of quote. Next slide. There's one of the stairways, made with logs. Even the steps are logs that are basically halved. Next slide. And a fireplace was added. It was built by a Hansen. This was probably Eben Hansen, who was from a Danish-American family that lived at Bailey's Harbour. Some of you remember the Hansens. They lived up by the Bluff Road. Well, later another log building was purchased and added to the north side of the cabin, and the space in between was enclosed with logs to make what became 3 rooms. Then several dormers were put on. Eventually they added to the north end another building, which according to Mrs. Cole, originally had been a log pig pen. Next slide. This is that fireplace. They also hired August Zahn, who was a really skillful blacksmith. We sit practically across the road from August Zahn's Blacksmith Shop. He started out mainly shoeing horses, but he also was a real craftsman with iron. And he made all of the lights and hinges and fireplace screens and andirons, other metal features of the Cole cabin, just as he made them for Björklanden. And Mr. Shook told him, "Mr. Zahn, you shouldn't be shoeing horses. You're getting all stooped over from bending over and shoeing horses, and you're so good at being a craftsman, you should really get more into that line of work," which he eventually did. Next shot. Here's a shot of the interior of Zahn's blacksmith shop. One time I stopped by and Walter Zahn, August Zahn's son, was there working, and I had to come in and look around. I knew Walter and Stella. They went to our church, Emmanuel Lutheran. And it was a very interesting building. There were a lot of nifty tools and still some remnants, fences, and other features that old Mr. August Zahn had crafted. Well, getting back to Frogtown, next slide. Well, here's one of the lights that's in the building. It's kind of interesting because it's from an old sawmill blade. Maybe that came from the Pruder Mill, which burned down behind the ice cream parlor in that area, down by the lake. Next slide. So anyway, Mr. Shook began to bring up young men who were World War I somewhat disabled students who had already enrolled and were taking classes at the Art Institute. Here's a shot of some of those guys. Most of these old photos were loaned to me by Mrs. Anderson. She had some good ones. And of course, in the beginning, they didn't have any electricity. Mrs. Cole said they used gas lanterns that were pumped up, and they used kerosene stoves. And a wood stove in the fireplace would heat the house, although they typically would come up around the middle of June when things would warm up a bit. Frogtown can get pretty chilly, as you know. She also said the Shook house was the first one built on Chapel Lane. And here the Shooks kept coming up summer after summer to continue spending the nice summer seasons in Bailey's Harbour. While it was being built, though, another house was also started next to theirs, belonging to Elmer Godfrey. I don't have any slides of that, but he was another gentleman also from Chicago. And it was believed that that building was also built by my father. Next slide. Well, convinced that the area's beauty had great potential for student artists, Shook and Poole, Frederick Victor Poole, one of his colleagues at the Art Institute, decided to establish a summer art school for the veterans of World War I, who were students in their classes in Chicago. So in June of 1922, along with another instructor, Harry D. Young, who was a bit younger than Shook and Poole, they brought up a group of about 45 students to Bailey's Harbour. Now, many of the students, especially the married ones, put up tents in what was then a large open field that ran along the lake south to about where the gates to Björklanden are now. Next slide. Go back one, I'm sorry, Leanne. Some of the others who were bachelors stayed at the old Lakeside Lodge. This building unfortunately burned down, but it was right on the corner toward the lakeside of Kitty McNeely's home, which is now owned by Donald Girdman. These were the bachelors pretty much. And here 3 young local ladies worked waiting on tables, one of whom was this Gladys Anderson that I mentioned earlier. Actually, her maiden name was Jorns. That's it. That's another old Bailey's Harbour name. And so she loaned me these photos, and when the students were there, they also worked to help build a studio down by the lake. Then in 1924, Mr. Poole decided to build a summer cottage. This was Mr. Shook's colleague. He decided to build it across the road because he didn't want to get too close to the lake, but yet he wanted to have a view of Lake Michigan. Next slide. This is Gladys Anderson in the quarry out at Tufts Point. That's still there. Next slide. The McKeon family, owned much of the long strip of land running south to where the gates of Björklanden are now located. Peter McKeon was a carpenter and the family patriarch. He was born in Dundalk, Ireland in 1853. And he got married in 1877, and almost immediately after he and his wife were married, they left for America, and they came directly to Bailey's Harbour. And there they became, in their time, quite an influential family. But like most of the town residents then, they were quite poor. As a result, their cows often ran loose to graze. And according to Mrs. Cole, they would eat the oddest things, including bathing suits hanging out to dry, even the soap that was left outside on washstands. The McKeons had 10 children. One of them, William, became the owner of the Lakeside Lodge. And other Irish families also settled on the Kangaroo Lake area. I remember going to grade school with some of their descendants, the Gosses in particular, Ann and Chuck and Tom and some of the others. Now, next slide. Now, most of us know this area as Frogtown. Mrs. Cole told me that some French people once lived nearby. They were probably loggers. Very early on they lived there. And during World War I, French Americans were often called frogs for short. Hence the name Frogtown became the name of that long strip of lakeshore property. Next slide. Well, the students would go out every day and sketch and paint around the county, and they were popular with the local residents. Since they didn't have much money, they organized their own entertainment. That included a variety of parties. Next, quite a variety of parties, costume parties. Sorry about that slide, it's not very clear, but then the original wasn't very clear either. Next one, also Leanne. Yeah. So they dress up and have fun, often bringing local young ladies from town out to their parties. Next slide. Sometimes they would all go to dances at Wassabeck's Hall. Next slide. So it must have been a fun place. It's too bad, really, that virtually nothing of it remains, except a few memories, I guess. Well, as Mary Ann Johnson put it in an excellent article that she wrote in The Advocate about the art colony back in 1974, she made some interesting comments. I'm going to just quote a few of them quickly. She said, quote, "The local Bailey's Harbor girls love to attend these parties." And according to Mrs. Cole, the young men did sometimes come into town and raise Ned, quote, as she called it, around town. They especially enjoyed next. Oh, this is a shot of the studio down by the water. No longer there. Next slide, Leanne. They especially enjoyed being in the Bailey's Harbor Parade. That was a big, big event then, even as it is today. It's an old shot of some people in the parade. And that would be Schramm's Ice Cream Parlor in the background. At least that's what it was when I was a kid. Well, at this time, most of the people up here were still quite poor, and they worked very hard. It wasn't easy scratching out a living if you were a farmer here in Door County with that shallow soil and all those stones that would flake off, have to be picked in the spring. My mother had many stories about working on her farm, which was just to the east of Birch Creek. Actually, Birch Creek was my grandfather's farm. Anyway, they all thought the summer people who came up here were millionaires. But as Mrs. Cole said, well, the artists certainly weren't. There's some interesting accounts in The Advocate about activities at the school. In August of 1922, we find that, and this is to quote from another article, "The artists were given an outing to Ephraim last Thursday. Mr. Folda took them to his home on Horseshoe Island by yacht. After spending the day, they were given supper at the different hotels. They returned home thanking Mr. Folda for their entertainment." Mr. Folda, of course, there's a book written about Horseshoe Island. At one time owned it, went completely broke, bottoms up in the Depression and lost everything. Next slide. That same month, the Bailey's Harbor Coast Guard gave a drill in front of the lodge for the students and for the benefit of the summer people. They would row out in these boats and actually roll them over and roll them back upside again. And there are, I think Bill Tuft is the man on the right with a mustache. There's a Hickey on this photo and a few others. I don't remember their names now. But some of the people at the old Coast Guard station were local people. You can see part of the Coast Guard station in the background. When Aribert Wild built the Bailey's Harbor Yacht Club, I remember talking to him about his plans one time, and I told him, well, one time there was a really interesting big old Coast Guard station here. You ought to try to reflect that in the design of your resort that you're building. And he took up on the idea, and working with a Chicago architect, that's what he ended up doing. Next slide. Later that summer, and I'm quoting again, "Many of the men went to a dance at Wassabeck's Hall. 3 prizes of oil paintings were given to the most comically dressed. All the work of the art students here is now an exhibit at what was formerly the Hickey Ice Cream Parlor." I never ever heard it called that, but maybe some of you longer time Bailey's Harbor residents would remember. That must have been Martha Wassabeck's and Angie's ice cream parlor. Another lengthy Advocate article stated that, quote, "When Uncle Sam wants to give his federal board art students good training, he sends his men to places of outdoor beauty and healthful environment, such as Door County. Sheltered in the comfortable confines of Lakeshore Lodge on the woody shores of Lake Michigan at Bailey's Harbor, more than 20 artists have lived for a week working under the direction of Professors Shook, Poole, and Harry Anthony DeYoung." He was by far the youngest of the 3 professors. all men of repute in artist circles in Chicago. Next slide. Seated all day on the picturesque wharves and hillsides, the former soldier boys are working enthusiastically with the pencil and brush, hoping someday to become artists as well known as their instructors. Excuse me. It's interesting to watch them as they sit hour after hour, never saying a word, except to ask their instructors a question or two as to the merits of their sketches. Little exercises in trees, little outlines of boats tied up at the docks, and rough sketches of distant shores cover sheet after sheet of drawing paper. Next slide. When asked whether or not they intended to make sketches of the many other pretty spots in the county before they left, Mr. DeYoung spoke up with surprise at the question, and he said, "The place where they are now is located so full of types that one couldn't attempt to try them all, even in one summer." Next slide. Well, the art school went on for 3 years and then stopped. Mr. Shook kept coming to Frogtown. He kept instructing a few private students who came to take art lessons. In 1924, the Muckins sold the Lakeside Lodge, and in 1925 and 1926, both Shook and Poole also taught at an art league in Green Bay. In 1930, the landmark Lakeside Lodge burned to the ground. In 1936, Frederick Poole died. But Shook continued his artwork, and in 1937 helped establish the Peninsula Art Association, where he was their first instructor. The following year, he retired from the Art Institute. Harry DeYoung, one of the instructors, went on to achieve great fame in artistic circles, winning many honors and awards. Some of his work is held by prominent art museums and public schools in Texas, Indiana, Chicago, and other places as well. Next slide, Leah. Over time, more buildings were erected on the old Mucken Road. They included the House of Seven Gables, or the Van Wingen House, and that of his friend Gus Carlson from Racine. Shook designed both of them, and my father built both of them. Next slide. Björklanden was built on back tax land in 1931. I still remember Mrs. Boynton. What a nice person she was, and how she was well liked by the townspeople. There was a big fire in 1935. It started near Maxwellton Braes, which had a dump located just to the east. One day, Mrs. Cole said, the cook was burning trash and the fire got away. The fireman called fire to the nearby residents. People came running with buckets of water. Well, it didn't do much good because it burned for day and night for 2 days, eventually reaching all the way down to Lake Michigan. Mr. Vail and Mr. Boynton then contributed money to buy a fire truck for the town. Next slide. Next slide. Well, there's Dorothy Cole. When I interviewed her back in, I think it was 1986. What became of all those students who went to the school? Mrs. Cole still remembered some of them. Most were from Chicago, but most of their names have been lost over time. Many continued their artwork. Mrs. Cole remembered a Mr. Beard who came back one summer, many years later, to look the place over. She also recalled a man named Tulsa, and another called the Gook, as she put it. One from the South stuttered, perhaps because of experiences from the war. Another, Warren Jure, moved to Green Bay from Chicago. He had a comic strip in a newspaper and became a curator at the Neville Art Museum in Green Bay. Another one, Jonathan Jacobson, became a very successful photographer at Cedar River, Michigan. Next slide. In 1940, Shook died at his beloved summer home in Bailey's Harbour. Today, the Frogtown Art Colony remains an important part of the history of our community, and the information and memories about it should be preserved for future generations. Next and last slide. Thank you. Thank you.
Much, Bill, for that very interesting presentation. Looking at those pictures, I'm sure some of you have memories of that area especially, and some of you, how many of you here live on Chapel Lane or Frogtown? Whoa, look at that. Wow, that is amazing. So for you, that's especially important, I think, to know the history of that area. The pictures on the wall are those that I had. Some of them are from Frederick Victor Poole. The one on the end here is one of the students, Charles Decker, 1923. And my grandmother, the Pyle family, owned a farm outside of town. And for whatever reason, my grandmother knew some of those artists, and of course, Grandma was always inviting people to the farm for dinner. So they would come for Sunday dinner, and I think they probably repaid her with some pictures. And she knew Frederick Poole, and apparently he had given her these, and they were in my attic. The picture of my grandmother was taken, it's a charcoal and ink drawing. Some of you artists probably know exactly what it is. But when I was, I don't know, in high school, maybe grade school, an artist who had been at the Frogtown Art Colony had come back to visit Door County. And my grandmother was probably around 80 or 85 at the time, and he asked if he could paint her picture. So what a neat treasure for me to have now of that, time in her life. So again, I want to thank all of you for coming. I hope that you will come to future presentations that we plan on putting on. I know that you will be as passionate about the history of Bailey's Harbor. I mean, we have so many different facets, the farming, we have the logging industry, the tourism, the farming. So there's many different areas to be explored and many mementos and memorabilia that we hope to put in the archives. And we were lucky enough that the Bailey's Harbor Town Board has granted us a room downstairs. So everything that we get will be cataloged. You'll be given credit for your donation, and we hope that we can continue. We already have gotten some nice donations. So I think the future is going to look really bright. Having a historical society that can really do a lot to preserve the history of this community. So again, thank you. Thank you so much for coming. It's so nice to see some new faces and some of the people that have lived here for many years. So we're all Bailey's Harborites, and we want to really appreciate what we have here. So thank you again so much for coming. And where did our presenter go to? Bill? We have a little something for you here. So I'd just like to give you this and very thankfully give you this for making the time to come up here and making the effort to come to Bailey's Harbor. So we'll probably tap into you in the future again also. So this is kind of a little bribe. So enjoy. A gift certificate to one of our local restaurants. So bon appetit. Thank you, Bill. Thank you. Thanks for coming. And thank you all for coming. Make sure you grab brownies. We have a lot of brownies to get rid of. So on the way out, grab a brownie. And if any of you have something to share, please do.
Program is?
Yeah, I mentioned it before. The July program is going to be honoring Marianne Johnson, and it's also going to be the Nelson's 65th anniversary of the Nelson family in Bailey's Harbor and the hardware store. So that will be really interesting, and Steve Hay, who is on our board, is going to do an oral history also with Gary Nelson about the Nelson family, and that is another facet of the Historical Society. We hope to do oral histories, and Steve is going to lend us his expertise and do these oral histories, because if we don't record these things, they get lost. And, you know, there's a lot of things that we have been lost in the past, so this is a way of keeping them going.
Does anybody have any questions?
That's what I was going to say. Maybe you have questions of Bill or some memory that you have of Frogtown or anything. This is a great time to come forward with your questions. Announcement from Bill.
I have one announcement. Lee Traven brought in 2 items from the art school. One of them is a painting by Victor Poole, a nice watercolor, probably of Anklam's fishing operation over at on the other side of the bay. And the other one is some more information about the art school and their instructors. Anyway, he's willing to sell them. So if any of you are interested, Lee's sitting in the back of the room.
They have 2 cool paintings, but they can't get any more because it's a small museum. The Wisconsin Museum of Art in West Bend is very interested. They collect only Wisconsin art.
Anyway, it's a nice watercolor. If any of you are interested, you can see Lee. I'll put them up in front here, Lee. How's that?
There's someone over here that
Just to take another turn, Mildred Armato, who was a very prominent artist up here, passed away since then, also lived on Frogtown Lane. And so maybe that atmosphere is going on for a long, long time.
we always, some of us remember Mildred Armato, absolutely a wonderful artist.
She began the red geranium back where the ice custard glass stand is.
Actually, she lived out in Kangaroo Lake.
They were all.
They were Kangaroo, but she had a home on Frogtown.
So that was her sister.
No. Oh, really? No, we had one. I visited Mildred in her house on Frogtown Lane, so, Chapel Lane. It's, yeah. No, I don't know.
She was a great artist.
She was an artist. Here's where she lived. Anybody else have any questions or anything they want to ask?
It's very difficult to find out information about the art school, Poole and Shook. You can Google them and go to other leads, and it's hard to track down information. However, Fred Johnson, who's here, the editor of the Door County Almanac series, also has some good information, I understand. We have to get our heads together one of these days. But are there any questions I could try to answer?
How are you spelling Shook and Poole?
S-C-H-O-O-K and P-O-O-L-E. I was at the Art Institute looking in their library for information many years ago, and I think I lost some of it, but there's some information there about when Mr. Shook retired, how much his retirement pay was, things like that.
There is a woman who lives on Chapel Lane who's a relative of the Poole family, Margaret Poole. So she may very well be a resource also.
Good suggestion.
She's the granddaughter of Frederick Poole.
Oh. So she's...
Excuse me, the great-granddaughter.
Okay. Yes?
Were there marriages between the town girls and these visiting artists? Is this how some of the families got started?
Wouldn't be a bit... I don't know for sure, but I wouldn't be a bit surprised. I think especially with some of the young men just getting out of the Army and coming up here and, you know, meeting some nice local gals, I'm sure that would have happened.
There's a future project.
Yes, sir.
These were all men that came up from the Art Institute. Were there no women in the school?
Apparently not. Tootie, you went to the Art Institute. Were there women? Well, yes, there were women students, but none of them came up here because Miss Apfelbach and Holtz were students. Yeah. Charlie, did you have a question? My nephew.
We just want to say that Tischlers are, very well known in this town. And whenever you hear that somebody has a Tischler-built house, you know it is an extraordinarily, wonderfully built house. Because way back when, we were building good houses in Bailey's Harbor, so they've always been renowned for that. Well, my grandmother, you always say that. You put a Tischler-built house, you know it's a good house. So they took pride in their work and it showed, so. And Charles Jr. here carried on the trade that his great-grandfather actually had. Is that correct? Right.
You'll have to do one on the Tischler family for us. You'll have to do a presentation on the Tischler family, Billy Harbour.
Well, got a lot of information on it.
Probably easier to track down.
Because I think I mentioned before, my grandfather, when he came from Germany, built his farm at what is now the Birch Creek Music Academy. But he worked for Emma Tuft out at the quarry, chipping away limestone, and would walk there every week all the way from, I think it was like 9 miles, all the way out to Tufts Point. And some of you may remember Miss Emma, who was a legend in her own time, a wonderful, interesting lady, very conservation-oriented, but she never had a college degree or never had a PhD or whatever. So she was kind of never really recognized as she should have been. But my father built 2 of the cabins out there, and she knew all my older brothers and sisters because she lived in town with her brother in a house next to the one that our family owned, now owned by some very good homeowners. And there's an exhibit down below of things that were found in the walls. I recognize some of my old toys. From the attic, there was a space between the studs, and if you dropped something down, you could never get it out.
And I think I'd like to personally thank Christy because those are her exhibits up there, and they are wonderful. And she's going to continue, I hope, to change those exhibits. And we are just thrilled to death to look at the pictures that are out there of the Gornowski family, and the other one is the cigar company in town. So it's wonderful to come in the library and be able to look at those exhibits. It's great.
I'm counting on all the people to tell me their stories, to tell us their stories, because there's a lot out there and it's just so interesting. Even though you maybe might think it's not, it is.
If people have old photos, old town photos, that you'd be willing to, well, I'll be up later on in the summer, June and beyond, that you wouldn't mind sharing, letting me scan into what we're hoping will be a nice database of old historic Bailey's Harbor photos. I'm Leanne Despotes, I'm the book, and I'm on the ground. I really appreciate that. I think we all would. It would be great if we could get them labeled and, get everybody connected up that way.
Later on, we're also going to do, my sister Diane Kyle had an immense collection of local postcards, Sister Day, Bailey's Harbor, and they're being scanned now, and we're going to have that as a program. And at some point, we will have those scanned photos into what DVD, is that the right way to put it, that what you can be available at the library that people can come in and look at it. And in and itself is a history because they're photographs that go way back. And they're very interesting. And part of the interest is also the message on the back, who wrote to who, and the postage stamps. Wow. So that's going to also become available. So we've got some exciting projects going on. And anybody who wants to get involved with us, please let us know. We're just trying to have more people and more input. In the future, maybe we'll be able to get a museum where we can exhibit this thing. But right now, we're very new and very much beginning our project. But we're sure looking forward to developing it into more and more.
In addition to being a fantastic place to grow up, Bailey's Harbor also had a lot of interesting elderly people that I remember when I was a kid, and they had incredible stories to tell about shipwrecks and how one's grandfather or great-grandfather from Finland went on a voyage around the world with his schooner collecting animals for a zoo back in Finland. John Brand, this was, I don't know if you remember him or not. And then there were town characters as well. Lee, we won't mention any names, but
Ironically, in the paper today, looking back 75 years, Michael McArdle, the man who donated the money for this building, passed away at his apartment in the Drake Hotel in Chicago 75 years ago. He was the man that donated the property and the building to the town.
And the Catholic Church.
And the Catholic Church, yes, you're right.
Maybe Michael. Maxwell Square.
Did you have a question?
I did. I've only lived here for 10 years, but one of the things I find interesting is in such a small geographical area, there were so many different immigrant sources of the immigrants, and I'm wondering, when you look back on, when people think about the early days, did people get along by all being here and they're starting anew in the new land as poor people, or were there ethnic tensions?
well, there is a Polish settlement. I think most of you know where that is. And a lot of people of German, northeast German, Pomerania primarily, ancestry. And as far as I know, my grandfather, who I don't think ever could speak much English, came from Germany, got along very well with his Polish neighbors. I don't think there was much intermarriage.
Definitely not between Catholics and Protestants. That was a no-no. As you can see by the cemetery even, you know. But you're right, Bill, and I remember that in my mother's book that she wrote, that, you know, it was such a, you had to rely on your neighbors, you know. If one man had a pig, and you had a cow, then you traded your pig for your cow, half of a cow, and that kind of thing, because they were all really self-sustaining farmers, and a lot of them. But there was, you know, the Polish settlement, and there was definitely the Irish with the McKeon family.
That's right.
And the Cassidys, and so you did have your distinct groups of ethnicity, but I think they all more or less got along because they needed each other.
Lynn,
Yeah.
I want to make sure you don't forget Moses Kilgore. There's a book written that says the real beginning of Bailey's Harbor began with Moses Kilgore when he came from Maine.
Well, you might want to be one of those people that we do an oral interview with.
I'd be very happy to.
That would be wonderful, because that is, Kilgore was one of the earliest families, but most of the land right around the school, all that, he owned acres, about 1,000 acres, so, right. He was the big landowner, absolutely. Those are the kinds of things you want to get down.
Our cemetery is also a great source of history. When I was on the town board, we never had a record, and so being that my dad had dug graves for 70 years, we plotted out the cemetery, and I recorded all the names and birth dates and death dates. On one of the headstones, it said Augusta Ray, R-E-H, shot in Lincoln Park, Illinois. And for years, I have been wondering, why was she shot? Why is it on her headstone? Barbara Andrews, who's on the town board, Googled it or whatever you do, I don't do that well, found out just the other day that she had been shot by her lover, who then turned around and shot himself. So there's so much history.
Here's this article, if you care to read it, just the language is kind of neat, because in those days it was very flowery, and it's amazing the way they wrote up this obituary. Very, very complete terms, exactly what happened. So I'll leave this here if anybody wants to read it. It's kind of interesting.
One final thing about Door County, it was always isolated. The trains never came up here. You had to get here by boat or really crude roads, which would take from Chicago sometimes 2 days, I've been told. So people intermarried, and the odds are, if you were German and Lutheran, you're probably related. Whenever I go out to the cemetery, I find more relatives, lots of them. I think we're related.
Well, in our town records, when the clerk would write the record, it was a story, unlike what we get nowadays when they have their regular notes. It literally was a story. They were having a board meeting. Somebody ran into the board meeting. This was back in the early 30s, I believe. And somebody had been to the cemetery. A man had shot himself. The board adjourned, went to the cemetery, and at that point, very graphically described how the man was found in the wheelbarrow. He had shot himself. The bullet went through the right side, came out the left side. It was extremely graphic. It was, you know, they told everything. And so there's so much in those record books. What we'd like to do at some point, sit in here, access these old records, which go back 1850 something or 1860 something. And everybody has a subject, so as you read, if there's something about Kangaroo Lake, we would then photocopy it. If there's something about the cemetery or all these different subjects, we could build a history of these different subjects by having all kinds of people looking at all these books instead of one person trying to go through everything. So if you're interested in winter, it's a cold day, we're going to see what we can do this winter and tap into that resource.
There's a book that John Collard wrote, one of his many books. It's on Door County cemeteries, and it's very, very interesting with pictures of the gravestones. It gives a lot of history about these communities too.
Because Door County was so isolated, I always think of some of the elderly people that I knew as being incredibly resourceful. They could build anything, fix anything, make anything. It was because this was an out-of-the-way corner. And you're right about, you know, everybody in town knew everybody, and they were all pretty neighborly.
We still do.
Incredibly so.
More than we want to know.
And it's so great to see so many people here with such a beautiful day. We were holding our breath thinking everybody's going, oh, it's too nice to come and sit in the room. But gee, thank you all for coming. This is just such a great show of support, and we sure hope you keep coming.